You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is October 15th, 2020, and our guest today is Steve Boucher. Now, Steve Boucher is an AutoCAD draftsman who lives in St. Catharines, Ontario. He is also a musician, singer, and fine artist. Steve has had experiences with non-terrestrial beings since he was a baby. The bulk of his experiences were buried in his subconscious mind for many years until he began to have brief flashes of conscious memory after reading Budd Hopkins' book, Missing Time. He is the author of Beyond the Extraterrestrial Firewall. His website, experiencer.ca, is up and running, and you can check it out, and there's all kinds of really cool stuff there. So, without further ado, we're just going to get right to it. We'll be right back on Conflict Radio with Steve Boucher right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. We've got Steve Boucher on the line. He wrote the book Beyond the Extraterrestrial Firewall, and he is an experiencer of an alien encounter beyond anything that you really read about. Steve, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing fine. It's thanks for having me on your show.
Man, it certainly is a pleasure to have you on. We don't get to talk to too many people who have been through what you've been through. Can you tell us your story? Can you give us a rundown of what happened to you?
Well, I'm what they would call a repeater case. I've had quite a few experiences with these gray aliens with the big heads and the very large black eyes, and it started from, well, I could say when I was a baby, but it actually, I have some pre-birth memories that that was the actual first experience with these beings that I recall, is in some pre-birth memories that I remember before I was born. And I've had, my case was researched by Budd Hopkins back in 1981, and he invited me to come up to his studio in Manhattan. And then after that, it was the case was taken over by the Canadian UFO Research Network in Toronto, and they've since disbanded. They're not around anymore, but they were around for a few years, and they did some good research into a lot of extraterrestrial visitation cases and UFOs. And so anyway, I didn't know that I had any experiences until I was until around 1981, and I bought Budd Hopkins' book, Missing Time, and I started to read it, and I found that as I was reading it, I was getting flashes of memory of similar events that were being described in his book. And one of those events involved my dad. And I started to get these memories of him and I in his car. We were driving back home from somewhere. And I was about 4 years old at the time. Excuse me. And I was sitting in the back seat of the car, and the cars in those days had a shelf behind the back seat. And I climbed up on this shelf, and I used to lay there, and I could look up through the back window at the stars. And so I was laying there on the shelf looking up through the window while my dad was driving, and I was watching the stars, and I noticed that one of them was moving. And I found that kind of strange because I'd never seen a star moving before. So I kept watching it, and it was getting bigger as I was watching it. It looked like it was growing in size, and then I realized that it was coming towards us. So I climbed down off the shelf, and I climbed over into the front seat and sat in the passenger seat. And I asked my dad, I said, "What's that light out there?" And he said, "What light?" And I said, "That light." And I pointed out the window. And at that time, this light was following us at treetop level. It was matching our speed. And when my dad, he hadn't noticed it until I pointed it out. When he turned and looked at it, he immediately went into a kind of a panic mode. So he stepped on the gas and he was trying to outrun it. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Shut up, leave me alone." And he never used to talk to me like that. I could see he was visibly frightened. And I couldn't understand why. And so anyway, the ship came down in the road in front of us. And my dad had to stop. And when it landed on the road, it lit up all the trees around the area, and it lit up the road almost like daylight. It was pretty bright. And we were sitting there in the car watching it, and two gray beings got out, and they were standing there in front of the ship, and they were looking directly at us. And my dad told me, he said, "Get down." He says, he managed to regain composure, and he said, "Stay down." He said, "Don't leave the car. Whatever happens, you stay in the car and stay low so they don't see you." And he says, "I'm going to go and find out what they want." And he said, "But I'll be back." And he said, "Under no circumstances must you get out of the car. You stay here." And I said, "Okay." And so he got out, and I peeked over the dashboard, and I could see him walking toward the two beings. And the one being that was appeared to be the leader, he walked up to him, and he kind of blocked his view with his body, so he couldn't see me in the car. And I was sitting there in the car, and I was getting bored, and I was trying to see who these beings were, if I knew them. I knew they looked different, but somehow I thought maybe I might know them or something. And so I was curious, and I decided to disobey him. You can get away with a lot when you're 4 years old. And I got out through the driver's door, and I started walking towards him. And he heard me get out, and he put his hand behind his back, and he started waving his hand at me, motioning me to get back, And I was too curious, and I came up behind him, and all of a sudden the being that he was talking to looked over his shoulder, and he looked directly at me. And then he looked back at my dad, and he said, "You seem to be concerned about the child." And I heard his voice in my head. And my dad said, "Oh yeah," he said, "that's my boy." And he turned around to me and he said, "I told you to stay in the car. Now you go back and get in the car and stay there and wait for me." And the being said to my dad, "Would you like my crew member to take him back to the vehicle for you?" And my dad said, "No, that's okay." He said, "We have to go. I have to go, and my wife's waiting for us at home, and, we need to go." And so the being looked at the other being, and he came over to me, and he took me by the hand, and he walked me back to the car. And I turned around, and I looked back, and my dad was standing in the road staring at us with this horrified look on his face, like he wasn't comfortable with that idea at all. And so the being took me back to the car, and I got in, and he got in beside me, and he sat in the driver's seat. And I could see my dad talking with the other being, and then they went inside the ship. And so I was sitting there with this gray being sitting next to me in the driver's seat, and he put his hands on the steering wheel, and he said, "What does this do?" And I said, "Oh, that makes the car go this way or that way, whichever way you turn it." Mm-hmm. He said, "Oh, I see." And then he said, what do these do?" And he pointed to the pedals on the floor. And I said, "Well, that one makes the car go, and the other one makes it stop." And he said, "Oh, okay." And then he pointed at the dashboard, at the radio. And he said, "What is that?" And I said, "Oh, that's a radio." And he said, "You hear music on it, and you can hear people talking." And he said, "Oh," he said, "can you talk back to them on it?" And I said, "Well, no, it doesn't really work that way." And he said, "Oh, I see." And he kept me busy. He kept me occupied. And my dad had gone on board the ship with the other being, and I'm not sure how long he stayed with me in the car, but he was basically babysitting me while my dad was having an abduction. And so he asked me, he said, "What do you do during the day?" He said, "Do you go to school?" And I said, "No, that's next year." And when I remembered that fragment of memory, I realized that I must have been 4 years old, because I would have started kindergarten at 5. So anyway, he kept me amused for a while, and then I saw my dad and the other being come back out, and they were standing in the road talking again. And the being that was sitting next to me looked at the other being, and then he looked at me and he said, "I have to go now." And I said, "Can't you stay a little bit longer?" And because I was enjoying his company. He was taking an interest in me, and he's keeping me entertained. And he said, he looked at the other being, and the other being nodded his head, and he said, "Now I do have to go." And so he got out, and he passed my dad in the road, coming back to the car. And my dad got in, and the two beings went inside the ship, and we watched the ship lift off the road, and it moved slowly over the trees. And my dad started the car, and he seemed kind of quiet. He wasn't saying anything, and we started heading home again. And then a strange thing happened. A little while later, they came back again and did the same thing. They went up ahead of us and came down in the road, so we had to stop. And I heard my dad mutter something like, "Oh, what the hell do they want now?" And so anyway, one being got out this time, and he came over to the car, and he motioned for my dad to lower the window. And back in those days, that they didn't have electric windows. You had to crank them down with a crank. And so he cranked the window down, and he said, "What is it?" And the being said, "You forgot these." And he handed him his glasses. So my dad thanked him and put his glasses on, and he walked back to the ship, and we saw the ship leave again. And that was the end of that experience.
Huh.
So when I recalled this, reading Budd Hopkins' book, at the end of the book it said, he had a paragraph that said, "If you feel that you may have had an experience similar to the experiences described in this book, and you would like to have them researched, you can write to me at Richard Merrick Publications," and he gave a number, an address, and he said, "and I will put you in touch with somebody who in your area that can help you. And so I wasn't sure whether to write to him or not. I was kind of debating it. And I thought, well, I think what I'll do is I'll ask my dad if he recalls this. And if he remembers any of this experience, then I'll write to Budd Hopkins. But if he doesn't, then I won't bother writing. So I went into the living room, and he was sitting there reading the paper on the couch, and I sat down beside him, and I said, "Can I talk to you?" And I explained to him what I remembered. At the time, I didn't remember the second visit where they brought him his glasses back. I only remembered the first one. Mm-hmm. And so I described that to him, and he said, yes. He says, I remember that. He said, I remember putting my hand behind my back and waving for you to get back in the car. And when he confirmed this, everything changed. It was like once there was confirmation, we both realized that it wasn't a dream and that I hadn't just manufactured this in my mind. It was an actual event that we shared. And so
so did he ever tell you anything about what happened to him inside the craft?
He did later on, quite a while later. Basically what happened to him inside the craft was that he said that they showed him some things that it was like a vision in his mind where he could see all these different inventions throughout history. Like it was, he described it as kind of like a museum of technology, where he could see all these different machines and inventions that from the past and right up into the future. And that's all I remember him telling me about what he saw on the ship, what they made him see this vision. And it's funny because my dad always had an inventive nature to him. He started out as a welder, and then he became a mechanic, and then eventually he got his millwright ticket, and he was working for the millwright union in the Niagara area, fixing machinery and stuff like that. But he always had this interest in coming up with inventions. And as I grew older, I kind of gained that same interest. And we worked on a couple of ideas together. And my dad, French is his first language, so he wasn't very eloquent in the English language. So I wrote up the patent applications for both of the inventions, and we got them. We got the patents on them. So one was an invention. It was an internal combustion engine similar to the Wankel engine. Mm-hmm. And the other one was a special container and process for making wine, homemade wine. It was designed to replace the demijohn bottles that most people make wine in. And it took about 3 years for each one, but we got both the patents. And unfortunately, they didn't go anywhere. We tried selling the idea to at trade shows and things like that, but winemakers were old Italian guys that have been doing it that way for the same way for years, and they didn't want to change. That was working for them, and our idea was it was a collapsible container that you could, like a plastic container that you could make your wine in and hang it in your basement from the rafters. And it was an interesting idea, but it's unfortunate it didn't go anywhere. But anyway,
I have some questions about the creature that got into the car with you. Now, sure. Did these guys have like longer fingers, Did they have 5 fingers? Did you notice? Do you remember anything about their hands or feet, for that matter? Were they wearing shoes?
They had uniforms on, but when I was 4 years old, I didn't really pay attention to their hands or their feet, and I just was looking at their face, and I could tell that this being's face was different. That it was a different shade of gray, kind of, and his eyes were what got my attention, because that's I discovered that's how you hear them, is when you look at their eyes. They communicate through their eyes. They don't communicate through vocally. In fact, I don't think they have a movable mandible jaw that moves. I think it's fastened to the skull. And so that's all I noticed about him at that time, that and the fact that he was wearing some kind of a uniform. Later on,
did it have different colors on
well, I seem to remember it as being like a darker shade of blue. Not quite a navy blue, but a darker shade of blue. And later on in future encounters, I was a little more observant, and I noticed that it was like a skin-tight fitting dark blue uniform, and I didn't really notice the feet. They were like boots, kind of. That's all I could remember. And as far as the hands go, I believe they had 3 fingers and a thumb.
Okay. Were they seem like they were long fingers, or were they like fingers like our kind of fingers?
They seemed longer, and their skin looked like kind of like a dolphin's skin, you know. Yeah, that's the best way I can describe it.
Did they blink at all? Do they have eyelids? Did they blink? Did you notice?
I don't remember them blinking. Whenever I was looking at them, their eyes were open, but I didn't notice if they actually blinked. I don't think they did.
And what about did they have hair at all? Like, or were they completely bald?
They were completely bald.
Not even like peach fuzz or nothing, right?
Nope.
That's interesting. So you had another experience with him later, when you were on a tour van when you were in a band.
Yeah.
Could you tell us that story?
Sure. I was, I guess, around 17 at the time, because I remember we were playing at the house band at this bar in Niagara-on-the-Lake called the American Hotel. And I was underage. And I was never questioned because I was in the band, and I didn't drink a lot of beer when I played, you know. I'd maybe have a draft once in a while. But after we played a gig at the American Hotel in Niagara-on-the-Lake, the drummer said that a friend of his had invited him to a party in Vineland, which is just as close to St. Catharines, but in the other direction. And so he said, "Are you guys up to going and maybe play one set? Or are you too tired?" Because we just finished playing a gig. And we were all pretty energetic back then. We said, "Sure, okay, let's go and do that." So we drove to Vineland, And it was a house party, and we found the place okay, and went inside to set up our equipment. And there was a Christmas tree in there in the living room and a pole lamp in the corner. We had to take the pole lamp down to get the drums in there. And so we set up and we played a set of our songs. And there was one guy there that I'd noticed he was there for a while. And when we finished playing, the drummer said, "Well, let's get out of here because it's getting kind of late and we should head out." And so we decided to go. And this guy that had been there, he came up to us and he was kind of drunk. And he said, "Are you guys going to St. Catharines by chance?" And we said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you mind if I get a ride with you?" He said, "I was supposed to meet a friend of mine here that told me about this party. And he said if I could get here, he'd give me a ride home, but he never showed up." And he said, "So I'm kind of stuck here." And we said, "Sure, you can come with us." So we piled all the equipment in the back of the van, and he got in and sat in the corner. And we started towards St. Catharines. And by this time, it was probably about maybe 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. And when we got to the entrance to the Queen Elizabeth Highway, the Jordan entrance was closed. So we decided that we'd take the service road and head down to the next junction and get on it there. And so we got onto the North Service Road, which follows the coast of Lake Ontario, the southern coast of it. And we were driving along and we were chatting in the van, and suddenly the driver stopped. And we said, "How come you're stopping?" And he says, "Well, you better take a look at this because you're not going to believe me." So we all kind of looked over the seat, and up ahead of us in the parking lot of this restaurant was a saucer-shaped craft sitting on the ground on the legs, and the lights were going on it. It had portholes around it and a row of red lights around the perimeter, and at the bottom of it, it had like little searchlights that were panning back and forth over the pavement. And we were far enough away that it wasn't a threat to us, but the driver said, "What do you think it is?" And I said, "Well, maybe it's a prop for a movie." And they said, "Well, why would they be making a movie in the middle of the night?" And so none of us wanted to go past this thing. We would have had to pass it to continue on our way. And so we weren't sure what it was, and we decided to turn around and take the back roads back to St. Catharines instead. And so the driver started to make his turn, but we weren't turning. And I said, "How come we're not turning?" And he said, "It won't turn." And he had his hands on the wheel, cranked over all the way. And we weren't turning. We were just heading towards this thing. And I said, "Well, put on the brake." And he says, "I'm trying." And he was stepping on the brake, and nothing was happening. We were just moving steadily towards this thing. And then I realized that I couldn't feel any vibration in the road that you normally feel when the rubber hits the road, you know?
Yeah.
And we were moving fairly quick towards this thing at the point where I was bracing for impact because I thought we were going to hit it, you know? and everybody in the van was panicking, and we were all talking at the same time and yelling, and everybody was upset, and and we came up to the thing about maybe 30 feet away and came to rest on the road again. And the van wouldn't start, nothing would work. And so we're all talking at once, and then the drummer, he was sitting in the passenger seat, and he turned around and he said, "Everybody just shut up." And so everybody went quiet, and he said, "If we don't move, if we stay down low so they don't see us," and he said, "then maybe they'll leave us alone." And we didn't have any other plan, and that sounded about the best, so we decided that we'd stay quiet and not move, and we made sure all the doors were locked. And so the guitarist and the drummer, the guitarist was driving and the drummer was in the passenger seat. They had front row seats for this. They were looking directly at the craft, and we were trying to stay low in the back. And then I heard the drummer say, "They're getting out." And I said, "What do they look like?" And he said, "They're just little guys." And I wasn't sure what their intent was, if they were going to attack us or what. And so my first response was to grab hold of the microphone stand in case they got in. I wanted to have something to defend myself with. And we could hear them trying the doors, and one of them went by the window. There was one window on the driver's side of the van, and this being went by. And when I saw his head go by, I said, "Did you see that?" And everybody went, "Shh, be quiet." And I said, "Yeah, but did you see that?" And the guitarist's girlfriend, Anne Marie, said, "Yes, I saw it." And they were trying the back door. And this stranger, this hitchhiker that we were driving to St. Catharines, he'd been pretty quiet the whole time. And all of a sudden he looked around at us, and then he just suddenly reached over and opened the back door. And we couldn't believe he did that. And the door flew open, and there were three beings standing in a lineup. And the being in front, which was, I believe, the leader, came right into the van. And he was standing up in the van, and he was clearing the ceiling by a few inches. And so they were pretty short, these guys. And he started looking around at us, and I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. And it looked like everybody was paralyzed like that. And he looked around at us, and he said, "I'm sorry, but we had to temporarily paralyze you because you were thinking thoughts of violence, and I was concerned for my safety and the safety of my crew members." And he said, "We don't mean you any harm. We're on a peaceful mission, and we're here we want to do some tests on some of you, and we won't keep you long, and once we do these tests, we'll bring you back and you can be on your way." And he said, "I need 3 people. And he looked at the bass player and he said, "You?" And then he looked at the hitchhiker and he said, "And you?" And then he turned to me, and when his eyes focused on me, I looked at the ground. I looked at the floor of the van. I didn't want to look at his eyes because that's how I could hear him. And the tension was so strong that I couldn't resist it. And I gradually looked up at him. And as soon as we made eye contact, he said, "And you?" And so he said, "Will you follow me, please?" And he turned around and he started moving toward the back of the van. And as he was moving, his foot got caught in the snare drum stand, and the drum fell over and it rolled out into the parking lot, and immediately one of the other beings picked it up, and he started looking at it and examining it. And so the bass player got out, and I followed, and I had my bag of instruments. They're recorders, that like an English flute, kind of, made of wood. And I took the bag with me as I got out, and I came face to face with the being holding the drum. I was like about 2 feet away from his face, and we made eye contact, and immediately this thought came into my head: oh my God, are you ever ugly? And immediately he turned his head away so that I couldn't see his face. And then I started to wonder, was that me thinking that about him, or was that him thinking that about me? Because it seemed like our minds were connected. And anyway, he handed the drum to the leader. And
I'm losing you a bit on the mic there.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
He handed the drum to the leader, and the leader said to me, "Is this yours?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Who does it belong to?" And I pointed to the drummer in the passenger seat. And he said to the other being, "Go and get him." So he went around and he came back with the drummer. And the leader handed the drummer to him, handed the drum to the drummer, and he said, "Is this yours?" And he said, "Yeah, it's mine." And he said, "Is it damaged?" He seemed to be concerned about that it may have gotten damaged. And he looked at it and he said, "No, it seems okay." And then he put it on the floor of the van. And at that point, the drummer ended up joining us. So instead of 3 people, we now had 4. And so he brought us around to the passenger side of the van, and he said, "I'd like you to line up in a line." And so we lined up along the side of the van, and he said, "We're going to go on the ship." And he said, "When we go on the ship, we're going to all go as one unit." And he said, it may seem a little strange, but he said, "Don't look to the left or the right." He said, "Turn to your left and face the back of the person in front of you." And he said, "And keep looking straight ahead." And he said, "When we go on the ship, don't touch the hull." So he went and stood in front of us, and another one of the beings stood behind us. And I could see that I was behind the drummer, and I could see him there in front of me. He had a black leather jacket on, and I could see the being in front of him. And we all kind of lifted off the ground and started moving towards the ship. And it was the strangest feeling, because we weren't moving our legs, we were just suspended. And we all moved as one unit towards the ship. And I got curious, and I just happened to turn my head to the left for a second, and we immediately stopped. And then when I looked straight ahead again, we kept going. And I thought, oh, that's how it works. So I turned to the right for a brief second or two, and we stopped again. And then when I turned my head forward, we kept on going. So I never did it again after that. And as we approached the ship, we kind of turned on a 90-degree angle where the doorway was, and there were stairs. They looked like corrugated stairs, corrugated metal stairs, and there was some kind of a railing, but we didn't walk up the stairs, and we didn't use the handrail. We just kind of all floated up on an angle, and the doorway of the ship was arched, and it was made for these short little guys wasn't really made for a tall guy like our drummer. And he banged his head as we were going in, and the being in front turned to him and he said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm all right." And he wasn't happy about it, but he was rubbing his forehead. And while we were stopped, I just briefly stuck my hand out and I touched the surface of the craft with my ring finger of my left hand, just lightly. I just wanted to see what it felt like. And it was warm, and it felt like a aluminum or something like that, And about 2 weeks later, I got a huge planter's wart on that ring finger, and it took me weeks to get rid of it. So
I would imagine that this happened before you read the book, right? That triggered the memory.
Yeah, this happened in 1971.
Okay, so I'm just like, how would actually? I was just wondering why your memory wouldn't be triggered by this happening of the earlier.
Well, this memory of this particular incident didn't come out until I went to Manhattan and I underwent a hypnotic regression with Dr. Aphrodite Clamar, who did the cases in Budd Hopkins' book Missing Time. She did 2 sessions with me, and that's when the van incident came out.
It definitely is an interesting experience. And again, you didn't notice any of the, I guess, the feet. And you're saying they were much shorter than you, about 3 feet tall.
About 3.5 feet, 4 feet tall at the most.
Did you get any sense as to whether they were male or female?
I felt that they were all male, and I also felt that they were, when I was talking to them, that there was a soul in there. It wasn't like a robot or anything. There was a soul. It was like I felt that they weren't much different than we were. They were just in a different form, a different body.
Yeah, I think you can definitely see life in somebody's eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure. So I'm sure that even their eyes, you'd be able to see that there's life there.
Right. And,
so did the ships look the same?
That's hard to say. All I can say is that they were saucer shaped, and I believe that they were the same. They all looked the same, but I can't be absolutely sure of that because I remember the important things, but there's certain details that I don't remember.
Yeah. Did the inside of the ship have like furniture at all?
It was very plain inside. There wasn't like I was expecting to see walls of electronic equipment and lights and screens and things like that, but it didn't really have that. It seemed kind of plain in there, almost like, and it felt like a military barracks or something like that. It had that feel to it, and I felt that these beings were soldiers, like that they operate under a chain of command. And although I didn't meet whoever was commanding them, I only met these gray beings. And so once we got inside, they separated us from each other. And I got the leader, and he brought me over to a bench. And it was kind of like a curved bench that followed the contour of the ship. And he said, "I would like you to remove your clothing and pile it in a pile on the floor. and we need you to do this so we can do the tests. And I looked at the other guys, and they were all starting to take their clothes off, and so I figured, okay. So I undressed, and I kept my underwear on, and I said to the being, "Can I keep my underwear?" And he said, "What is underwear?" It's like he didn't understand the word. And I pulled on the strap to show him, and he said, "Yes, you can keep that." And I wanted to bring my bag of instruments with me, because where I go, they go, you know. But he said, "Put those on top of your clothing on the floor." He said, "You'll be able to see it from where you are. Nobody's going to take them or anything." And so I put them down where my clothes were, and he brought me over to another part of the ship where there was cabinetry that was curved that followed the contour of the ship. And there was like a countertop on this, and he asked me to get up on the countertop. So I got up on it, and I was sitting there, and I could see the other being had like a metal table with a towel on it, and there was stuff in the towel, and he was starting to unroll the towel, and I saw that what was in it looked like surgical instruments or dental instruments or something like that, you know. And the leader left me sitting on the countertop for a minute to go over and talk to this other being. And while he was gone, I was thinking to myself, I've got to get something. I need to get something from this ship, because nobody's going to believe me when I tell them this. And so there was nothing that was loose that I could grab, but my hand came to rest on a knob on the one of the drawers on this cabinet. And I started wondering if it would unscrew. And so I started turning it, and sure enough, it unscrewed. It was getting looser and looser, and I was pulling on it as I was turning it, and it came off, and I had it in my hand, and I wondered, like, what am I going to do with it now? I haven't got any pockets to put it in or anything, and so I just held it in my hand, and the leader came back over to me, and he said, "We're ready to do the test now." And then he sort of cocked his head sideways a little bit. And he said, "What have you got?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You took something." And I realized then that you can't hide anything from these beings, because they always know what you're thinking. It's part of their telepathy is part of their nature. And somehow he knew. And when I realized that he'd caught me, I opened my hand and showed him. And he took the knob out of my hand, and he looked at it, and then he looked at me and he said, "You can't keep this." And the other being that had the instruments on the table said, "Why not let him keep it? What harm can it do?" And he looked at the other being and he said, "We're not supposed to let them keep anything." So that's when I realized that he was under some kind of a obligation to a law of some sort. They weren't allowed to let us keep anything. So he took the knob and he put it in a place where I couldn't reach it. And then he brought what looked to me like a metal gurney, like you would see in a hospital. Mm-hmm. He brought this over to me, and I was sitting on the countertop, which was about the same height, and he said, "Would you shift over onto this for me?" And so I shifted my body onto the gurney, and he wheeled me over to where the other being was with the instruments, and he picked up an instrument off the table, and it looked like a hand unit for a contemporary phone. And he said, "I'm going to show you how this works." and he turned it on, and he held out his arm, and it shone a green light on his arm, and wherever the beam from this thing hit his arm, I could see the skeleton underneath his skin. I could see a skeletal structure. And then he said to me, "Now I'd like to try it on you." And I said, "Is it going to hurt?" And he said, "No, it won't hurt, but it may tingle a little bit." So he said, "Would you hold out your arm, please?" And I held out my arm, and he turned the light on. And I was amazed that when he put it on my arm, I could not only see the bones, but I could see the muscles, and I could see the veins and the arteries and nerves, and I could see everything that was in my arm. And I could even see the pulsing of my heartbeat. And I was amazed at this instrument. And he said, "Now we'd like to take a look at your stomach with this." And he said, "Would you lay back, please?" And so I laid back on the gurney, and him and the other being, and there may have been a third being as well, came over, and they were looking with this instrument inside my stomach and inside my body. And then I don't know what they were looking for, but they must have found it. And then they said to me, he said, "Look up at this light." And there was a light above me that was kind of, it was a big round light, and it had, the bulbs were round. They were like concentric circles. And this thing started pulsing from the outside to the inside through these concentric circles, and it would draw your attention into the center of it. And as I was looking at this thing, I was starting to get really tired. And I didn't want to look at it. I turned away from it, and I said, "I don't want to look at that thing." And he said, "No," he said, "look at it. It's very important." He said, "Look right into the center of it." And so I looked at it again. And as I was looking into the center, and these lights were moving toward the center, I just blacked out. And when I came to, it was, I'm not sure how long I was asleep, but I woke up, and when I looked next to me, the one being was rolling up the instruments in the towel, and the leader said, "I'll take you back to your clothes now, and you can get dressed." And all this time, the drummer refused to cooperate. He was standing there by the entrance to the ship, and the being that was with him was trying to get him to remove his clothing, and he kept saying, "No, I am not going to do that." And they argued for quite a while, and finally the being that was with him gave in, and he said, "Well, I respect your tenacity," or whatever. I'm not sure. It was something to that effect. And he said, "But would you wait here while the others are having the examination?"
So you said he was standing by the. You said he was standing by the door, the entrance to the ship. Was after you guys went in, did they close the door?
No.
So you guys could have just jumped out at any time, or?
We could have, but once you talk to them, the fear goes away. Like they immediately took the fear away, and I could move again when that happened. And so I had no fear of them. I didn't believe that they were going to harm us at all after that. And so there was no reason for us to run away. And we had agreed to go through this exam. So, but the drummer wouldn't agree to it. And the being managed to talk him into staying and waiting by the door for the rest of us. And so anyway, after I woke up from sleeping, the being took me back to the benches where my clothes were, and he said, "You can get dressed now." And so the other guys were putting their clothes on and getting dressed, and I noticed that the hitchhiker was wearing long underwear. And so I thought that was kind of unusual that he was wearing long underwear, but it was winter and it was cold. There was a Christmas tree in the house we played in. So anyway, as we were getting dressed, the leader and the other being that had the instruments in the towel, he came over, and the two of them stood in front of us, and the leader said, "If there's any questions that you'd like to ask us, now is the time, because we have a few minutes." And so the first guy to ask a question was the bass player. And he said, "Where are you from?" And they said, "Do you know anything about the stars?" And we said, "No, not really." And he walked over to a star map that was on the wall. And he said, "Well, it probably won't mean much to you then, but we're from this area here." And he pointed to this spot, like a group of stars. And now, after several hypnosis sessions, I have come to believe that where he was pointing was Orion.
Yeah, so when you say star map, was it like a screen that had like a map of stars on it, or was it like an actual piece of paper that was tacked to the wall, or was it like just a picture stuck to the wall, or what do you mean by when you say star map?
Well, I wish I could answer that, because I've never really thought about it, but I knew that it was a map. It was clear to me that it was a map, but whether it was paper or whether it was on a screen, I couldn't really tell you. But I could see all the stars on it, and so he pointed to this area, and he said, "We're from this area here." And then it was the hitchhiker's question. And he said, "Do you have any bases on Earth?" And the leader said, "Yes." He said, "We have several bases here on Earth. As a matter of fact, there's one right out here." And he pointed toward Lake Ontario. I'm just going to have a sip of water here.
Okay.
So after that, while they had been asking these questions, I had been thinking to myself, they probably get asked these questions all the time. So when it comes my turn, I'm going to ask them something a little more profound, something that they wouldn't normally expect. And when it came to my turn, I said, "What is the true religion on Earth?" And they both looked at each other, and they looked back at me, and the leader said, "Why would you ask a question like that?" And I said, "Well, because you're obviously a lot more advanced, technologically advanced than we are. You're probably more socially advanced, and I would guess that you're more spiritually advanced as well. So if anybody knew what the true religion is on Earth, it would be you guys." And he seemed to ponder over my question, and then he suddenly said, "There is no true religion on Earth, and that's the end of the questions." And I said, "Well, wait a minute." I said, you can't just leave me hanging like that. Can't you explain a little more?" And he said, "No." He says, "That's the end of the questions." He says, "We've probably told you too much already." And so I was kind of perplexed that he just suddenly stopped answering questions at that point, and everybody had pretty much gotten dressed, and they led us over to the entrance again. And the drummer went down first, and the other guys started going down, and I deliberately was made myself the last person to go down the steps, because I was hoping that I could talk to this being a little more. So once the other guys left the ship, I was about to follow, and just as I was about to take a step down the stairs, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Wait." He said, "I'd like to talk to you some more." And so I stopped, and I immediately went unconscious again. And the next thing I remembered, I was standing in the parking lot, and it was cold, and I was looking at the ship, and the leader was standing in the doorway of the ship, and he was silhouetted from the light in behind, and I remember seeing these big black eyes staring at me, and I was feeling this emotion of extreme love that I've never felt that kind of love from any human being in my life. And it was like an extreme unconditional love. And I remember my face was itching, and he was telling me something, and I felt like I was waking up and my face was itching, and I went to scratch my face, and it was all wet. And I realized that I'd been crying. And I started wondering, what was it that he was saying to me that made me cry? And I was trying to recall it, and it's like trying to recall a beautiful dream that you wake up from.
Yeah.
And you're waking up and you can't get back to it. You're reaching for it, but it seems to be drifting away. And that's how I felt, like whatever he told me, it was in my subconscious mind, and I wasn't being allowed to understand it with my conscious mind. And I was so interested in trying to find out what he was telling me. And he could sense my dilemma. And he came down and he came up to me and he distracted me. He said, "Wasn't there something you wanted to show me?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "There was something you wanted to show me." And then I realized it was my bag of recorders. So I took the tenor recorder out. I opened up the bag and I took the tenor recorder out and I put it together. It was in 3 pieces. And I played a little bit on it to show him what it sounds like. And then I handed it to him. And I felt him pull it out of my hand, and he looked at it, and I thought he was going to try and play it, and he started putting it up toward his lips, but instead of his lips, he put it. Why is he putting it to his nostrils? And he blew into it a little bit. He got a couple of sounds out of it, and I found out later on when Q-Form took over my investigation of my case, they showed me a book that they had, and it was a book about an alien autopsy performed by Leonard Stringfield. He's like a well-known name in the field of ufology.
Mm-hmm.
And when they showed me this document, he had said that he witnessed the autopsy of a gray being. I believe it was one of the beings from Roswell. And he said that apparently they have one organ that controls, that does the job of the heart, the lungs, and the liver. And they don't have a digestive system the same way that we do. It's the throat or the mouth stops at the throat. It's like a pocket, and it doesn't go any further. And so they have to breathe through their nose. And that's when I got the answer to that question of why he put it up to his nostrils to play the recorder. Because they don't breathe through their mouth. But anyway, so he handed the recorder back to me, and I took it apart and put it back in the bag. And I pulled out the soprano recorder. It's the smallest one. And I thought, I can get another one of these. So I handed it to him, and I said, would you like to keep this as a souvenir? And he said to me, what is a souvenir? And I said, it's like a gift to remember me by. And he said, that would be fine. And he took it from me, and he put it to his belt, and it just stuck there. And I was surprised that it stuck to his belt, because there was no metal in it or anything. It wasn't magnetic, but it just clung to his belt when he put it there. And then I started thinking to myself, I hope I can get another one of those recorders from that music store. And as I was thinking this, he immediately took it off his belt and he handed it back to me. He said, would you like it back? And I said, no. I said, you keep it. I kept forgetting that they could see my thoughts, that they knew everything I was thinking. And so he kept the little soprano recorder, and I kind of joke about that it's probably in some alien museum out there in space somewhere now, Yeah. But anyway, I felt like a strong bond with this being, like I knew him somehow.
Now, inside the ship, did you notice any colors? Was it colorful inside, or was it plain?
It was plain. I just remember it being like kind of a military gray or military green or something like that. It was very plain.
It was. You said you were sitting on a countertop. Do you remember if it was cold or not?
No, I don't remember. I don't think it was really cold. It might have been cool, but I did notice that it followed the contour of the ship. It was curved.
Yeah. So did it
against the outer perimeter of the ship?
Did it seem like it was expelling any kind of heat at all?
No, but
like the craft.
There was light inside, but I couldn't from it. Just everything seemed to be moderately lit, and outside the hull it was warm, and I could see like what looked like heat waves coming off it. Kind of like what you see in the summertime on the pavement when the sun is really hot.
Okay. Did it make any kind of sounds or hums, or was it humming at all, or was it making any noise?
Yeah, it made what sounded like air escaping, like some kind of a pneumatic system. I could hear like air escaping from it.
Was it kind of hovering there, or was it like on a landing gear?
It was on a landing gear, like legs.
Yeah, did the legs like go up and down as it, like, say the ship took off? Did the legs go back up? Like, did it retract itself?
Yeah.
Did it seem like it was hydraulics?
I couldn't tell you, but it seemed like they moved up into the ship, and as it left. But as I was leaving this being, I asked him, he said, would you like me to walk you back to your vehicle? And I said, no, that's okay. But I said, am I going to see you again? And he said, yes, you'll see me again. And so I walked back to the van, and the back doors were open. And as I was approaching the back doors, I looked inside, and all the people in the van looked like they were frozen in a state of suspended animation. And as soon as I climbed in, they all came to life. And they seemed to be in the middle of a discussion. And so the drummer looked at me and he said, we've made a decision. And he said, and we need you to agree to it. And I said, what's that? And he said, we are not going to tell anybody about what happened. And I said, no. I said, I'm not going to agree to that. I said, people need to know that these things are happening. And he said, no. He said, we've all decided that we won't tell anybody about this because nobody will believe us. And he said, if you tell anyone, we'll deny it and you'll look like a fool. And I was really upset because I wanted to talk about it and I wanted to tell people about it. And they just wouldn't have any part of that. And I also noticed that the hitchhiker was no longer with us. And that was the first time I noticed that he was gone. And I said, what happened to the hitchhiker? And they said, we don't know. And so we watched the ship leave, and it went over toward Lake Ontario, and it was moving toward the middle of Lake Ontario, and it was getting smaller and smaller. We could see it as a bright light getting smaller in the distance. And I could hear these beings in my head telling me, you're going to forget. You're going to forget everything that happened. And all the way home, I was having a mental argument with them, telling them, no, I am not going to forget. I am going to remember this for the rest of my life. And so this argument went on until they finally got to my house and they dropped me off. And I went inside, I unlocked the door and I went in. My parents were in bed. I went into the kitchen and I made myself a sandwich, and I got a pencil and a writing pad, and I made notes in point form of everything that I could remember that happened to me. And I tore the page off and I put it in the top drawer of my dresser. And the next morning, the memory was gone and the paper was gone. I didn't find it again until many years later.
Where did you find it?
Well, I keep a portfolio of the journals that my case was published in. Canadian UFO Research Network Journal, and another one called Flying Saucer Review. So when Q-Forn took over my case, they gave me a pseudonym because I didn't want my real name used. Mm-hmm. I said, you can publish the case in your journal, but don't use the real names of anybody in it. And they weren't too pleased about that, but they honored my request. And what I didn't know at that time was that Grant Cameron, who wrote the foreword for my book, he was investigating UFOs at that time, and he'd heard about my case, and he approached the guys at Q-Forn, and he asked them if they'd tell him my name, and they said no. He's asked us not to reveal his real name. And so they stonewalled him, and he couldn't get my name. And it wasn't until years later, in 2016, when I decided to go public with my story for the first time and reveal my real name. I went to the Alien Cosmic Expo in Brantford, and there was a group there one of the events was this group called the Experiencers Group, where anybody who had some kind of experience with UFOs or with extraterrestrial beings could have a few minutes to get up on the stage and explain their story. And I had in mind that I was going to do this. Before I left, I dressed up a little bit instead of wearing shorts and a t-shirt, because I thought if I get a chance to go up and talk about my story, I'm going to do it. And so I kind of made a commitment to myself that if that opportunity presented itself, I would do that. And so I went there, and a couple of people were speaking on the stage, and they said, now we're going to open the mic up to whoever would like to come up and tell about their experiences. And I went up, and I started talking about my experience, the van incident that I just described, where my band was abducted. And I got interrupted for lunch. They had to take a lunch break. And after lunch, I got the opportunity to go up and finish my story. But during the lunch break, I was approached by Grant Cameron. And at that time, I didn't know who he was. And he walked up to me and he said, I know that story. And I said, how can you know my story? And he said, because I tried to get in touch with the guys from QFON. And he said, I spoke to a guy named Larry Fenwick, and I asked him for your name, and he wouldn't give it to me. And he said, but I know your story. And he said, when you started talking, all of a sudden I remembered it. And he said, I have to make contact with this guy when he finishes speaking. I got to talk to him. And so that was the beginning of my friendship with Grant Cameron. And he encouraged me to write this book. And he agreed to write the foreword for me, which I was very happy about. And so anyway...
yeah, it definitely is a fascinating story.
Yeah.
So how long do you think they come and grab you again?
Well, they came from when I was a very small child. My first encounter in this physical body was when I was about 2 years old. And they visited me up to about 1976. And then the physical visitations stopped happening around 1976. And it was around that time when I think I married my first wife. And so the encounters stopped, but the connection with them was still there. And I've always felt that they've kind of taken the position of being spiritual guides to me now, because when I go into a bookstore, I look at a number of books, and sometimes one of them will leap out at me, and I get this sensation that I have to buy this book. There's something in there I need to know. And so a lot of times I feel like my intuition is being guided by them still. So I do have this psychic connection with them.
Now, did you get a sense at all about their age?
No.
Did they seem like they were, like, maybe some were older than the others, or like, did the leader seem like he was older than the other ones, or did they all kind of seem the same age?
Well, they all kind of seemed the same age, and they seemed like, to me, I felt that they were young guys, that they were like us, but they just were in different bodies. And like I say, when I looked at them, I could see that there was a soul in there. They're people. They're just, and I believe they're capable of good or evil, just like humans are.
Did you notice any helmets or I guess space suits inside the craft?
No, no helmets.
And there wasn't any way to see outside of the craft, like what was going on outside of the craft, other than the doorway.
No, there were portholes. They were recessed portholes, recessed into the hull. And when you looked at the wall, you could see these portholes. You couldn't see much through them unless you went up to one of them and actually looked out. But they were, let's see, above the extreme perimeter of the craft. They were in the upper part, and they were recessed.
So it's a multi-level craft then? Like it had different levels, like 2 or 3 stories?
I think so, yeah.
That's interesting. All right. Well, Steve, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, I have a website. It's a domain that I bought, and I built a new website on there called experiencer.ca, all lowercase letters. And if you go there, you can view my artwork, you can hear some of my music, you'll see some of the video interviews that I did, one of which has 2.2 million views now, and some pictures of that I took at UFO events like the Alien Cosmic Expo, pictures of people I met there like Linda Moulton Howe and Travis Walton and Richard Dolan, and there's also a connection to my book that tells where you can buy the book. It's available at amazon.ca, and it's also available as an ebook from Kindle. So, and I'm going to use the website to keep people informed if there's anything further events that happen to me. I'll post them there. And so the book references the website, and the website references the book. So it gives people a place to go if they want to follow up and want more information.
Yeah, it is a pretty neat website. I'm scrolling through your photos now. I see one with Travis Walton. Did you and him have a pretty interesting conversation?
We did, actually. I talked to Travis for a little while, and I also met Paul Hellyer, Canada's ex-Minister of Defense, and so I met quite a few people there. I met what's his name? Captain Randy, I can't remember his last name now. But
Yeah.
he was part of the secret space program.
Well,
And yeah, and just bringing that page up now.
yeah, it's a really interesting site. Well, we definitely appreciate you taking the time to come on the show with us today. Thank you so much for being a guest. And
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah.
awesome. And we'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. That's going to do it for us today. Remember, you can always find us online, www.conflictradio.net. You can also find our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for the Conflict Radio Network. Be sure to like and subscribe to us on Apple iTunes. And leave a review if you can. That would be great. Apple iTunes loves reviews and stars and all that kind of stuff. So give us a rating there if you can. You can also find us on all of the normal podcast catchers. Until next time, batten down the hatches and be safe.